I was in love with a woman who was kind, gentle, and full of light. I wanted to marry her, and eventually we did. She became my wife, my everything. But to my shock, my family strongly opposed our marriage, and I couldn't understand why. It felt unjust, baseless. Their disapproval created a rift between us so deep that I broke all contact with them. For nearly 4 months, I didn't speak to any of them. Then came the phone call that shattered my world. My parents had died in a car accident. When I heard the news, my body went cold. I was sick with grief and horror. I couldn't forgive myself. I was drowning in guilt so heavy it felt like a chain around my neck, tightening with every breath. I suffered in silence, tormented by the memory of the last time I spoke to them. I didn't even say goodbye. What made it worse, what deepened the wound beyond repair, was what I discovered after their death. The true reason behind their disagreement. A truth I hadn't known, one I hadn't even considered. And when I found out, my grief and guilt merged into something unnameable, something that clawed at my sanity. The pain was no longer just emotional, it was neurological. I was admitted to the neurology department, placed under constant observation by a doctor who soon began to suspect something wasn't quite right, but neither of us could say what it was. I decayed from the inside out in a matter of weeks. I experienced something like a mental death. Not just depression, no, it was something deeper, darker, a collapse of my very being. Finally, after a year of silence, pain, and unbearable reflection, I understood. I realized I was wrong. Not just about my family, but about myself. Because back then, I was carrying 2 deep and dangerous burdens. The first was hot. The first burden I carried was the loss of my loved ones. The second was a mistake I had made myself, one that could never be undone. Yes, I began taking medication and seeing a counselor, sometimes for hours at a time, but nothing seemed to lift the weight. It was as if the entire world had dimmed, like someone had poured black ink over my eyes. I was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. Through it all, my wife never left my side. She stood beside me with a quiet fierceness, reminding me again and again that no one can stop fate. "This wasn't your fault," she would say, holding my trembling hands. "You weren't responsible for your parents' death. You're just human, and humans make mistakes, sometimes with no bad intention at all." Her words gave me something to cling to, something small but steady. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. On the advice of my doctor, I began taking walks, simple walks around the neighborhood to help in the healing process. I didn't expect much from it, but one evening, around 8 o'clock, something unexpected happened. While walking through the park near my house, I saw someone. A man. At first I didn't recognize him, but he recognized me. It was Lee, a distant friend from high school, someone I hadn't seen in years. He had brought his grandchildren to the park that evening, 2 little ones with bright eyes and innocent laughter that contrasted sharply with the sorrow I would soon discover behind his tired smile. We talked for a while, catching up slowly. Then, as if the weight of silence had been sitting between us too long, Lee opened up. That's when I realized he had endured something 1,000 times more painful than anything I'd been through. 2 years ago, he lost his son and daughter-in-law in a devastating car accident. Just like that, they were gone. After their deaths, Lee had been admitted to a hospital. Not for injuries, but because the grief was so overwhelming, the doctors were afraid he might harm himself. They kept him under observation, bedridden, not for physical wounds, but for the kind that bleed inside the soul. Hearing this broke something in me. I was saddened deeply, not only for him, but for the realization that so many others in this world carry invisible wounds. I wasn't alone. Not really. There were others whose grief mirrored mine, or in Lee's case, surpassed it in cruel intensity. And yet there he was, sitting beside me on that park bench, breathing, talking, laughing gently when his grandkids ran past him. I hadn't heard from Lee since high school. He'd left years ago, disappeared from our small world like a leaf in the wind. But now here he was again, at just the right time, as if fate had orchestrated it. That night, as we sat beneath the soft glow of the park lights, we began to remember the beautiful days of our youth, days we once took for granted. The laughter, the mischief, the innocent dreams we used to chase. We both agreed that we hadn't appreciated them enough. After a long silence, I turned to Lee and asked, "How did you handle it? How did you survive all that pain?" He looked at me, eyes worn but steady, and said, "I went to a charity group, not to receive anything, but to give. I volunteered without expecting the slightest benefit." He paused, watching his grandchildren from afar, then added quietly, "They help people who really need it. And honestly, that's how I coped. That's how I made it through." Then he said something that struck me deep. "I realized that sometimes death might be more merciful than the life that lies ahead for some people, more beautiful than the suffering that waits." He wasn't denying his grief. "Of course I went through hell," he said, "and not seeing my son, my daughter-in-law, it still tears at me. But I've come to believe that maybe, just maybe, their departure saved them from something even worse. That thought brings me some peace." I looked at him. He didn't look well. His face was drawn, and there was sorrow in the way he carried himself. But behind all that, there was strength, purpose, acceptance. He told me about the many people he met through charity work, people battling illnesses, poverty, loneliness, all trying to escape the grip of pain in different ways. And then something happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a shift inside me, like someone had gently reached into the storm in my chest and calmed it just a little. That night, it felt like someone had finally found me in my darkness and lit a candle. That evening with Lee didn't just bring comfort, it opened a new window in my mind. We showed each other another angle, a different lens through which to see what had happened to us. And though the pain didn't disappear, it began to look different, manageable, human. Before we parted ways that night, I asked for his number. "I'd like to visit that charity place," I said. He smiled and nodded. "Come when you're ready." 2 days later, I met Lee again, and we walked together to the address he'd given me. It was a very old house, modest, tucked away in a quiet part of town, but it was spotless. They'd transformed it into a charity center, not to make money, not to show off, but to help. There was no trace of pride or profit there, only humble, common people with uncommon hearts. Lee explained, "No one here earns a salary. We give time, we give effort, because we've all lost something, and somehow, giving brings it back." Inside, I learned about the families they helped. There was one family whose wife had an autistic child. The mother, already elderly and worn by life, needed to stay by her child's side day and night, almost like a nurse. But she couldn't afford help, not financially, not physically. She was exhausted. Then there were families too weak to cook for themselves due to illnesses, cancer, disability, depression, and volunteers prepared meals for them, bringing not just food, but a little light into heavy homes. On my 3rd day volunteering with Lee, we visited a house that stayed with me long after we left. The mother of the family was blind, and beyond her blindness, she had other complications that made life unbearably hard. She struggled with everything, from walking to simple tasks, and yet she was trying to care for her children. Her strength was heartbreaking. I stood in that home, and for a moment, all my pain and guilt seemed to sit quietly in the background, humbled by hers. We cooked 2 warm meals for that family and cleaned their home as best we could. The next day we did it again, with even more care, even more heart. Something had shifted in me. From that point on, I made a quiet vow to myself I would help as many people as I could, anyone in need, anyone hurting, anyone forgotten. And from there, my life brought me face to face with one of the most extraordinary people I would ever meet. One afternoon, the head of the charity gave me a new task. He handed me a small piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. "There's an old man who needs help," he said. "He was born incomplete, they say. His body never fully developed, and now with age, even the tasks he used to manage are too much for him." He made a quick call to the man to let him know I was coming. When I stepped outside, I looked at the address again and realized it wasn't far from where I lived. That lifted my mood. It was comforting, somehow, to think I'd be helping someone close by. And from what I saw on the map, the neighborhood wasn't bad at all. But when I arrived, the door in front of me was old and rusted, barely hanging on its hinges. The paint had long since peeled away, and ivy crept up the walls like time itself trying to swallow the place. I pressed the doorbell. A few long minutes passed before I heard a frail voice from inside. "I'm coming. Now." Eventually, the door creaked open, just enough for me to see a small figure standing there. It wasn't a man. It was an old woman. She had white hair that looked like it hadn't been brushed in days, and she wore worn, shabby clothes. Her eyes were tired, but there was something strong behind them, like she had stories to tell, decades of them, buried beneath sorrow and dust. I offered a gentle smile and said, "Hello." I introduced myself kindly, trying to mask the nervous flutter in my chest. She stepped aside and invited me in. To my surprise, the house was rather large and surprisingly clean. An old charm lingered in the walls, like time had slowed down inside. The woman introduced herself as Karen. We sat down together and shared a quiet cup of coffee at the kitchen table. She seemed calm but weighed down by something, as if there was a truth she wasn't sure how to express. "I've been taking care of Mr. Richard for a very long time," she said, her voice warm but tired. "Now, it's time for me to retire, but someone needs to look after him until the new nurse arrives." She paused and looked toward the hallway. "I'll be honest with you, it's not easy," she added quietly. "The place is a bit of a mess. Not the house itself, but due to Mr. Richard's physical condition." She looked back at me, searching my face. "He's a cheerful man, truly. But before you go any further with your good intentions, I need to share something with you." I leaned in slightly, sensing the weight behind her words. "Richard has a brother and a sister. Both of them are busy with their own lives, families, jobs, cities far away, but they do visit him from time to time. They try to be present." She sighed, stirring her untouched coffee. "But Mr. Richard doesn't treat them kindly, not at all." She looked toward the hallway again. "I don't know what will become of him once I'm gone." I felt a strange chill pass through me. A few minutes later, she stood up and led me down the hallway toward Richard's room. When she opened the door, I froze. What I saw inside truly frightened me. Richard sat in a large armchair near the window, his eyes scanning us with a vacant sharpness. His appearance, it was haunting. His body was twisted, malformed in a way I hadn't expected. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. His limbs, thin and stiff, looked as though they barely held together. His face bore the kind of lines that don't come from age alone, but from deep pain and perhaps anger buried too long. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't fear nor welcome. It was something else entirely. All of Richard's bones were thin, so fragile, brittle like dried twigs, as if the slightest touch could snap them in half. As Karen had warned me earlier, I had to be incredibly careful. The tiniest wrong move could break or crack his spine. The slightest jolt, and the damage would be irreversible. Despite his physical condition, Richard's mind remained sharp. He spoke clearly, without a hitch, his words coming out smooth and confident. It was a strange contrast to the frailty of his body. I swallowed my unease, pushing past the fear gnawing at me. I turned to Karen and said, "I'll come here for a few hours every day to help you." Her face lit up with gratitude, and I could tell how relieved she was to have a willing hand to assist. After a brief moment, we stepped away from Richard's room and sat down in the quiet kitchen again, away from the unsettling atmosphere in the hall. "I'm supposed to start tomorrow," I said. Karen nodded, her face softening as she leaned forward, speaking with quiet sincerity. "I've been taking care of Richard for so long," she began. "He's a good man, but it hasn't always been easy. His condition, it goes way back." I hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had been in my mind since I first stepped into the house. Why was he in such bad physical condition at birth? What happened? Karen took a deep breath, her eyes flickering with a sadness I couldn't quite place. "His mother, she consumed alcohol during pregnancy. That's what his siblings told me." I nodded slowly, my mind trying to process the heavy weight of her words. "Is it just Richard who's affected, or do his siblings have any problems too?" I asked, trying to understand the full picture. "No," Karen replied. "His siblings are fine. They've all had normal lives. Richard, though, he's different." I raised an eyebrow, feeling a shift in the air. There was something more here. Seeing my confused expression, Karen added, "Richard's siblings, they're from another woman, not the same mother." The words lingered in the air, thick and heavy with the weight of something untold. I decided to keep working at the house to uncover more about who Richard really was. The next day, after work, I returned to the house. When Karen saw me, her face brightened, and she immediately left me alone with Richard. He was sitting in his room, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. I took a few steps toward him, but before I could reach the door, his voice interrupted me. "Now, I don't need you. Don't enter my room for a few hours," he said, his tone flat, almost cold. That was the moment I realized how difficult it was going to be to work for him. He didn't call for me, didn't ask for anything. The silence between us stretched for what felt like forever. It was hard to figure out how to be of any help when he wouldn't speak, wouldn't even acknowledge my presence. But there was something in that silence, a strange kind of tension that made me even more determined to understand him. One day, while taking Richard outside, I noticed something strange. Several portraits hidden behind his bed. They caught my attention immediately. The sketches were fresh, not old at all, and the detail was remarkable. Curiosity piqued, I turned to Karen and asked, "Is Mr. Richard able to draw portraits?" She looked at me with surprise in her eyes. "No, he can't move his body." A day or two passed, and this time I noticed a small container of paints tucked away. My curiosity couldn't be held back. When I was helping Richard into his wheelchair, I said casually, "I've always dreamt of being a famous portraitist." Without even looking at me, he replied, "Then why did you become a teacher?" For a moment, I froze. I couldn't move. How did he know? I had never mentioned it to anyone, certainly not to Karen or anyone at the charity. A voice inside me whispered, "He is not an ordinary human." That night, when I got home, I shared everything with my wife. She listened carefully, then urged me to find an excuse and not go back to that house. But despite her concerns, some strange energy, pulled me back there. It was as if I couldn't resist, almost as if I had no choice in the matter. The next day, which was Saturday, I went in the morning. I was talking with Karen when Richard called for me. I went into his room. He asked me to put him in his wheelchair, which I did. Then he told me for the first time to take him out of the house. It felt unusual, but I complied. The weather was pleasant, and we headed to the park. We found a quiet spot, and he sat there, watching everything closely, as though trying to absorb every detail. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "Could you bring me a glass of water?" I was taken aback by the simple request. "Do you want to drink water?" I asked, still uncertain about what he was really asking. I obeyed his request and went to the water tap. I found a disposable cup and filled it, bringing it back to him. "Here is the water." I was surprised to see Richard raise his hand and take the cup. He held it for a few minutes, and then, as if on cue, a pigeon landed on his hand and began drinking the water. The moment felt surreal. I was sure now he was no ordinary human. There was something else about him, something that defied explanation. On the way back to the house, I couldn't hold my curiosity any longer. "Mr. Richard, why don't you allow your siblings to help you?" I asked as we passed by the cars and people in the street. He refused to answer and seemed to ignore my question at first. I couldn't let it go. I asked again, this time with more insistence, "Why don't you allow them to help?" Finally, in a tone as cold as it was firm, he replied, "I know what they are intending to." I was confused, but I pushed on. "Neither brother nor sister wants bad for their own brother," I said, trying to reason with him. "Parents, do they want their child's evil?" Richard asked, his voice steady, cutting through the air like a blade. I answered quickly, "Of course not." "Then why did you leave your parents after an argument?" he asked, his words heavy with meaning. I froze when I heard his question. How did he know about that? How did he know so much about me? My hands went cold, and I couldn't even move the wheelchair. My mind was racing. Who was this man? Richard must have sensed my confusion because he added, "I want to go home. I need to rest." His voice had an edge of finality to it. "Push the wheelchair. I want to go home." My hands were shaking as I grabbed the handles of the wheelchair, trying to steady myself. With those trembling hands, I pushed the chair until we arrived at the house. Richard called out for Karen several times, but there was no answer. I tried to take him to his bedroom, but he refused. "No, I want to stay here," he said, his tone firm. I sat down on the sofa, unsure of what else to do. Richard, as if sensing my hesitation, spoke again. "You can go home." "I'll wait until Karen returns," I said, my voice soft but determined. "No need," he answered simply. "But she needs my help," I insisted, looking up at him. "No worries," Richard replied with an eerie calmness. "She can find someone to help." I got up to leave, but Richard spoke again, his voice as calm as ever. "Go to your mother-in-law's home and look at the photos in the photo albums." The words hit me like a thunderclap. Without thinking, I rushed out of the house, wanting to escape the mysterious man who seemed to know too much about me. But as I stepped outside, I suddenly remembered I had left my cell phone behind. I turned back, intending to quickly grab it. As I entered the patio, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Richard, who had been in his wheelchair just moments ago, was now standing. He was talking to someone, his voice low and animated, as though nothing was wrong. The sight was so strange that I froze, momentarily paralyzed by confusion. I completely forgot why I had come back. My heart raced as I turned on my heel and ran out of the house, not looking back until I reached my own home. That night, I called the charity and found an excuse to continue my work with them, my mind too overwhelmed to process everything. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. One day, my wife and I decided to visit her mother. As usual, my wife and her mother busied themselves in the kitchen, leaving me with a moment of peace. I remembered Richard's words and decided to check the photo albums, curious to see if they held some secret, as he had implied. I flipped through the pages until one photo made my heart skip a beat. I was shaken to my core as I recognized a face I had seen long ago, one I had never expected to see in my mother-in-law's album. It was the moment of revelation. I now understood why my parents had disapproved of our marriage. My wife, it seemed, was not just a stranger to my family. She was a love child. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The family of my brother's wife had kept it a secret, and they had gone to great lengths to hide it. My wife's true identity had been buried for so long, and no one, not even her, knew the full truth.